The girl who lost everything in one night. The rain came down hard over the Mississippi River that October evening, turning the cobblestones of Natchez, Mississippi into a slick, black mirror. Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of her family's estate, Whitmore House, a sprawling antebellum mansion that had stood since 1847, and felt the first tremor of something wrong in her bones. She couldn't name it yet, but at 26, with her dark hair plastered to her face and her silk evening gown clinging to her skin, she had learned to trust the instincts that whispered through her family's old blood. She had everything that night, or so she believed. Her father, Judge Harrison Whitmore, was hosting his annual autumn gala in the grand ballroom. 300 guests swirling beneath crystal chandeliers that had survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, and every storm the Gulf Coast had thrown at the Mississippi Delta for nearly 2 centuries. Her mother, Eleanor, moved through the crowd like a queen, her silver-streaked auburn hair pinned in the same style she'd worn since Clara was a girl. Her younger brother Thomas, fresh back from his second tour in Afghanistan with the 155th Infantry Regiment, was laughing at the bar with his old high school friends, his army dress uniform crisp and perfect. And James Caldwell stood by the French doors, watching the storm with that quiet intensity that had made her fall in love with him 3 years ago in the law library at Ole Miss. He was a public defender in Jackson now, fighting losing battles for people who couldn't afford to fight for themselves, and he hated these parties with every fiber of his honest soul. But he came. For her. Always for her. "You're soaked," he said, not turning around when she stepped through the doors onto the veranda. "You're observant. I've been watching you since you walked out there." He finally looked at her, and his gray eyes held something she couldn't read. "Clara, we need to talk." "That sounds ominous." "It sounds like real life." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I got the offer. Federal Public Defender's Office, Chicago. Starts January." The rain hammered the magnolia leaves. Somewhere in the garden, a wind chime her grandmother had hung 50 years ago began to sing its broken song. "Chicago," she repeated. "Clara, I can't do this anymore. This place. These people. Your father looks at me like I'm something he scraped off his shoe, and your mother—" "James, stop." "No. I've been stopping for 3 years. Every time I want to speak, I stop. Every time I want to take you away from here, I stop." He stepped closer, and she smelled the bourbon on his breath, the rain on his skin, the desperation in his voice. "Come with me, tonight. Leave this house and this life and these ghosts. Come with me and we'll build something real, something that's ours." She looked past him, through the rain-streaked glass, at the warm golden light of the ballroom. She saw Thomas throw his head back in laughter. She saw her father raise a champagne glass in a toast she couldn't hear. She saw her whole life, every expectation, every obligation, every whispered promise she'd made to the memory of ancestors she'd never known. "I can't," she whispered. "Not tonight. Not like this." James nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already decided. He pressed the envelope into her hand. "My number in Chicago. If you change your mind. If you ever change your mind." He kissed her forehead, and then he walked down the veranda steps into the storm, and he did not look back. Clara stood there, the envelope growing damp in her fist, and she felt the wrongness in her bones again, stronger now, a vibration that seemed to come up through the earth itself. She went back inside. She smiled at guests. She accepted a glass of champagne from a waiter whose face she would try to remember later and fail. She danced with her father to a jazz quartet playing Moonlight in Vermont, and she laughed when Thomas cut in, spinning her across the floor with the reckless energy of a man who had cheated death and intended to keep cheating it. At 11:47 p.m., according to the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, the lights flickered. At 11:48, the fire started in the East Wing. Nobody knew how. The investigators would spend 6 months speculating. Faulty wiring in the century-old walls, a candle too close to a curtain, a gas leak in the renovated kitchen. But in that moment, as Clara stood in the center of the ballroom and watched the first orange glow bloom behind the velvet drapes, she knew only one thing. The world was ending. "Everyone out!" Her father's voice, trained by decades on the bench, cut through the rising panic. "Calmly, through the front doors!" But fire doesn't respect calm. Fire is hungry and ancient and indifferent to human dignity. Within minutes, the East Wing was a furnace, and the old house, with its dried timber and horsehair plaster and decades of accumulated varnish, began to consume itself with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. Clara ran, not toward the doors, but toward the stairs, because Thomas had gone upstairs to retrieve his service jacket, because Thomas never could leave anything behind. "Clara, no!" Her mother's scream followed her into the smoke. The second floor was a nightmare of heat and darkness. She found Thomas in the hallway, coughing, disoriented, his hand on the door of their father's study. "The medals," he gasped. "Dad's medals from Korea. Leave them!" She grabbed his arm, pulled him toward the servants' staircase, the narrow back stairs that had been used by enslaved people a century and a half ago, stairs that existed in the house's memory but not its blueprints. They stumbled down, emerging into the kitchen garden as the roof of the East Wing collapsed with a roar that sounded like a living thing dying. She dragged Thomas to the oak tree at the garden's edge, the same tree where she'd had her first kiss at 15, where she'd read her first law book, where she'd sat with James last spring and talked about a future that now seemed like a dream told by someone else. She turned back to the house. Her parents were still inside. She would learn later what happened, how her father had gone back for her mother, who had gone back for the family Bible with the genealogy going back to 1720, how they'd become trapped in the master bedroom when a burning beam fell across the hallway, how the Natchez Fire Department, heroes every one of them, had found their bodies holding each other, her mother's head on her father's chest, as if they were sleeping. But in that moment, watching the house that had stood for 175 years become a pillar of flame against the Mississippi sky, Clara Whitmore felt something inside her tear loose and fall away. It wasn't just her parents. It wasn't just the house with its memories and its ghosts and its weight of history. It was the certainty that the world was ordered, that love protected you, that if you were good and loyal and true, the universe would reward you with stability and safety and dawn. She had lost James, walking away into the rain. She had lost her parents, consumed by fire and devotion. She had lost the house, the land, the name, the future that had been written for her since birth. And Thomas, who sat beside her in the dirt, his uniform jacket scorched, his eyes reflecting the flames, began to shake. Not from cold, from something deeper. The war had already taken pieces of him, and now the home that was supposed to welcome him back, to heal him, was ash. "Clara," he whispered, "what do we do?" She didn't know. She had never not known. She had been Clara Whitmore of Whitmore House, daughter of Judge Harrison and Eleanor, sister of Captain Thomas, beloved of James Caldwell. She had been a story with a predetermined ending, a book with the last chapter already written. Now she was nothing. Now she was smoke and rain and the hollow space where a life had been. The fire burned until 3 a.m. The neighbors came, the ones who had envied the Whitmores for generations and the ones who had loved them. They brought blankets and coffee and casseroles, because that is what Southerners do when the world falls apart. They wrapped Clara in a quilt stitched by the quilting bee at First Presbyterian Church, and someone pressed a styrofoam cup of coffee into her hands, and she drank it without tasting it, because the body continues even when the soul has stopped. At dawn, the rain finally ceased. The house was a blackened skeleton. The magnolia tree was scorched on one side but still standing, because magnolias are stubborn and ancient and refuse to die easily. Clara stood in the garden, the quilt around her shoulders, and watched the sun rise over the river, turning the water to beaten gold. A car pulled up the long driveway, gravel crunching under tires. She didn't turn. She knew the sound of that engine, the particular rhythm of that old Ford pickup. James got out. He looked at the ruin of the house. He looked at her, standing in the garden in a burned evening gown and a borrowed quilt, her face streaked with soot and tears. "I heard on the radio," he said. "I turned around at the Alabama state line." She said nothing. She had no words left. The English language had failed her, all its poetry and precision reduced to ash like everything else. He walked to her. He didn't touch her. He just stood beside her, and together they watched the sun climb over the Mississippi, and the river kept flowing as it had for 10,000 years, indifferent to human grief, carrying the water of 1,000 storms toward the Gulf. "I don't have anything," Clara said finally. Her voice sounded like someone else's, rough and strange. "I don't have a home. I don't have parents. I don't have a name that means anything. I don't even have a change of clothes." "You have yourself," James said. "You have whatever you decide to build from this. That's not nothing, Clara. That's everything." She looked at him then, really looked at him, this man who had offered her a life she was too afraid to take, who had come back when he had every reason to keep driving north. "I told you no. I chose this house over you, over us, and I chose to turn around." He reached out, tentative, and brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. "People make choices, Clara. Then they make new ones. That's what being alive means." Thomas emerged from the neighbor's house where he'd been sleeping, his eyes red, his hands shaking worse now. He looked at James, looked at his sister, looked at the ruin of everything he'd fought to come home to. "Chicago," Thomas said. "You said Chicago, Caldwell?" James nodded. "Federal Defender's Office, pays terrible. Hours are worse, but it's honest work." "I was a combat engineer," Thomas said. "I know how to build things, rebuild things." He looked at the blackened skeleton of Whitmore House. "I don't think I can stay here. Every time I close my eyes, I see fire." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic movement of the soul. She had spent her life being the daughter of Whitmore House, the keeper of its traditions, the prisoner of its expectations. She had been so afraid of losing it that she had almost lost herself. Now it was gone, and she was still standing. "Chicago," she repeated, and the word felt strange in her mouth, foreign and full of possibility. "I've never seen snow." Time. She said goodbye to the ghosts, to the wait, to the girl she had been. Then she turned to the two men who remained, her brother, broken and brave, and the man who loved her enough to come back. "Let's go," she said. They drove north in James's old Ford, the three of them crammed in the cab with everything they owned in garbage bags in the truck bed. They crossed the Tennessee line at sunset, and Clara pressed her forehead to the window and watched the land change, the magnolias giving way to pines, the flat delta rising into hills. In Nashville, they stopped at a diner where a waitress named Darlene refilled their coffee without being asked and didn't charge for the extra pie. In Louisville, they slept in a Motel 6, Thomas on the floor because he couldn't handle beds anymore. And Clara lay awake listening to her brother's nightmares and James's steady breathing and the strange sounds of a city that wasn't hers. In Chicago, they found an apartment in Rogers Park, 3 rooms above a Polish bakery where the smell of fresh bread woke them every morning. James went to work defending people the system had already condemned. Thomas found a job with a construction crew rebuilding old houses on the South Side, and slowly, week by week, his hands stopped shaking when he held a hammer. Clara enrolled in law school at Loyola. She had never thought she needed more education. She had been raised to marry a lawyer, not become one. But the fire had burned away all the old assumptions, and she discovered that she loved the law not as a legacy, but as a weapon, a way to fight for people who had lost everything, who stood in the ashes of their lives and needed someone to believe they could rise. She married James in a courthouse ceremony in March, when the Chicago winter was finally breaking, the lake ice beginning to crack and groan. Thomas was their only witness, and afterward they went to a diner and ate pancakes and laughed until they cried, because joy was still possible, because love was not a memory, but a choice made daily. Years later, she would take her children back to Natchez. The lot where Whitmore House had stood was empty, overgrown with kudzu and wild roses. But the magnolia tree still stood, scarred but blooming, and she told her daughter the story of the girl who lost everything in one night and how she learned that everything wasn't what she thought. "Did she find everything again?" her daughter asked. Clara looked at the tree, at the river in the distance, at the man standing beside her with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes, and love still burning bright in his heart. "She found something better," she said. "She found herself." Closing note. Hey there, beautiful souls. If this story moved you, if you felt Clara's fire and her rising, if you believe that we can lose everything and still become more than we were, then you're exactly where you belong. This channel is built on stories that matter. Stories about broken people who refuse to stay broken. About love that shows up in the ashes. About the American soul in all its messy, magnificent, complicated truth. We've got so much more coming. Romance that will make you believe again. Thrillers that will keep you up until 3 a.m. Stories from every corner of this wild, wonderful country, from the bayous of Louisiana to the canyons of Utah, from the streets of Brooklyn to the wheat fields of Kansas. So here's what I need you to do. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell. Be part of this community of dreamers and storytellers, and people who still believe that words can change a heart. Good luck out there, my friends. Whatever fire you're walking through right now, keep going. The other side is closer than you think. Stay with us, stay for the stories, and we'll see you in the next one.